And very happy to have on the line with us Professor Dana Fisher, Professor of Sociology at the University of Maryland. The website, Dr. Fisher, drfisher.umd.edu. And you can tweet Professor Fisher at Fisher_Dana, D-A-N-A-R. And Professor Fisher, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Tom.
Thanks for joining us. So you have done some just extraordinary data on the resistance, and more specifically on the Women's March. What have you learned, broadly speaking, about who the folks are who are showing up in the streets in large numbers to participate in these protests?
Well, just like you say, Tom, I've been studying the resistance since it began on the day after the inauguration last year. So I took a research team out to the huge Women's March 2017 in Washington, D.C., and since then, at all the large-scale marches that have happened in Washington, D.C. since then, we've had a team out and collected data so that we know something about who they are and why they're out there and what they stand for. And what I can tell you is that in some ways, all of these marches are consistent. They all tend to be more female than male, although the women's marches are more female than male than the other ones for obvious reasons, because the focus is on women particularly. Most of the people who are coming out are politically liberal. Although what's really interesting with last weekend's event, is that the Women's March 2018 actually mobilized a lot more people who identify as moderates and identify as right-leaning than ever before. So 15% of the people in the crowd this past weekend were actually either moderates or right-leaning individuals, which is really interesting. I can tell you that the people who participated in the marches tend to be civically engaged. They contact their elected officials. They vote, obviously. They also have gone to town hall meetings, and those numbers have been going up over the past year since Donald Trump came into the White House. And I can also tell you that while across the board at all these events, people report mostly voting for Hillary Clinton, the percentage of people who are Clinton voters versus third-party voters and others is actually going up. So fewer and fewer people identify as being Clinton supporters, and rather they're more third-party and people who come from other places politically who are coming out into the streets to march.
That would include Bernie-crats?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Or people who voted for Johnson, people who chose not to vote as a form of resistance of their own. And in fact, we had a few Trump supporters in the crowd last weekend at least.
Remarkable. What does this say about the viability of this move? Well, actually, even before I ask that question, or maybe you can incorporate your the answer to that into the answer to this perhaps larger question. What is the focus of this movement based on the research that you've done? I mean, having a movement against something, can be really useful if you've got something really evil that you're fighting against. I remember, I was a very big part of the anti-Vietnam War movement. But once the war was over, it was like, okay, let's go get high. It's like, what do you do? I mean, actually, most people moved on to other issues, civil rights and things like that. But my point is that it seems that long term, the movements that really endure are movements that are for something rather than against something.
I completely agree with you. I mean, the thing that I think is interesting, it is true that what unifies all these people is they tend to be resisting the Trump agenda broadly defined. And that's actually how I define the resistance, is the resistance are people and organizations who are standing up to President Trump, his administration, their policies. But what's really interesting is we've gone into the crowds, and at each one of these marches, we've asked people, what are the issues that motivated you to participate? And it runs the gamut. So while they are resisting the Trump agenda, generally, they are for, and I'll just give you the percentages from this past weekend because they're remarkable. 92% were for women's rights, which makes sense. It's a women's march. You feel like a lot of people, it makes complete sense that a lot of the people will come out because they care about women's rights. 67% of the people came out also for the environment. 76% came out for racial justice. 78% came out for immigration. 89% came out for social welfare. And actually, 73% came out for politics and voting, and 72% came out for to resist Trump specifically. So while it is a resistance to the Trump agenda, it's for progressive policies across all of these issues. And the people in the streets, based on my conversations with people while I was serving them and just observing out in the streets, is people are concerned. And they're not just concerned about women's rights, and they're not just trying to be against something, but they're really taking a stand. And these percentages are up substantially from 2017 when we asked the same question. So people care more, and I would argue they're more outraged than they were a year ago with regard to these policies.
We're talking with Professor Dana Fisher of the University of Maryland, professor of sociology, who's been studying the resistance movement since the inauguration of Trump and the giant protest the day after the first Women's March. Back 8 years ago, 10 years ago, whenever a Tea Party group would get together, even if it was just 100, 200 people someplace, the news media couldn't get enough of it. They were all over it. The Tea Party was so wildly overrepresented relative to their numbers, that I would argue that, much like Donald Trump himself, the Tea Party was an invention of television. It was an invention of, or they were very successfully manipulating television, because so much of the Tea Party activities were being funded by the Koch network through their various front groups. And of course, they have some very large, very expensive, and very powerful public relations firms. What do you think accounts for the fact that the press coverage, even though some of the marches this last weekend were actually larger than they were a year ago, the press coverage was largely absent over the weekend, and there have been smaller marches all over the country in the intervening year, and they've gotten none of that Tea Party treatment. They're largely ignored, or they're treated as anecdotes or afterthoughts. Is that a structural thing? Does it reflect as in the Tea Party was well funded and had a PR apparatus? Is it that and had an entire political party that it was in the process of capturing that created kind of a symbiotic relationship? Or is it the institutional bias of corporate media? Or is it something else that I'm not imagining?
These are really, really important questions, Tom. I'm so glad you're asking them. I mean, I want to just say one thing about the Tea Party, which I think is interesting and reflected in the resistance, is that a lot of the resistance has been specifically through groups like Indivisible, trying to model their actions off of what the Tea Party did. And, Indivisible started as this Google document that, that crashed the network, and now it has, Indivisible at least says that they have at least 2 organizations in each congressional district in the whole United States.
Right.
I mean, what's also very interesting is many Indivisible groups actually were founded on buses coming back from the Women's March, which I think is a really interesting origination story. The Tea Party, at the same time that they did go to town hall meetings and have these meetings, there were very few large-scale marches, and none of them as large as last year's Women's March or this year's Women's March, where conservative estimates have people who turned out this past weekend for the anniversary of the Women's March at almost 2 million people.
Right.
That's a huge march in and
So
of itself.
we've got about 5 seconds left here.
I'm so sorry. So basically what I would just say is that there's no question that the media is not covering this. And I've been trying to be very generous in my interpretation. I'm not sure that it is a structural response as much as people from the media perhaps concerned about backlash for seeming like they're too left-leaning by supporting this. But this is a huge movement in the United States. It is not going away. It is turning towards the districts and towards the midterm election.
Yeah.
And it really matters.
It absolutely does. Professor Dana Fisher, you're doing great work. Thanks so much for sharing it with us today.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Great talk.